I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first panel for today, and then introduce the speakers. So this panel takes its name and inspiration from the larger theme, sites of departure and sites of return. And what I really wanted to do with the panel itself was to kind of blow open the ways in which we think about departure and return in the context of Ghana, which is oftentimes in kind of popular narratives so tightly wed to the transatlantic slave trade and to diasporic return, heritage tourism, all things that we will explore and talk about not only on this panel, but throughout the coming days. But I wanted to think about all of the other kinds of departures and all of the other kinds of returns that animate this long history that are not sort of confined to the questions of the slave trade, to questions of heritage tourism. And so that way, I'm so grateful for the 4 speakers who have agreed to be here today, because as you will see as they give their talk, each one of them brings a different dimension to this very long history, to a complicated and complex set of departures and returns. And we've also agreed that because you can read everybody's biographical details in full in the program, that we will keep introductions very short so that we can really focus on the presentations and the conversations to come. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers on this panel, and then invite the first one to come up. So our first speaker is Professor Jessica Millward, Associate Professor of History at the University of California at Irvine. Next is Kwesi Essel-Blengson, Director of Education in Ghana Museums and Monuments Board, Ghana. Next, after Kwesi, is Professor Ebony Kuletu, Assistant Professor of African American Studies, English and African Studies at Pennsylvania State University. And then finally will be Fatima Dadzi, filmmaker who's based in Ghana and in South Africa. And I very much hope that those of you who are here have had the opportunity to view her incredible documentary, Fati's Choice, which is available on the Africa Institute's website. You can view that for free. And even if you haven't had the chance to watch it yet, I urge you sometime over the coming days to see it. It's just such a powerful documentary, and so we'll get to talk more about that. So Jessica, I'd like to invite you up to the stage. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. So I'm first up. I'm the opening act. As you can imagine, I had many versions of a paper that I wanted to give to you today, and because I deal with slavery, because I deal with ghosts of the past, sometimes it's important just to yield and to listen to what they're trying to tell us. So this isn't necessarily the paper I was going to present, but it's the paper that needs to be presented. Charity Folks is a ghost of slavery who refuses to be silenced. She finds herself in the company of Margaret Garner's beloved daughter. She finds herself in the company of a girl we know only as Celia, a slave, Sojourner Truth, Queen Nanny of the Maroons, and countless unnamed women who haunt historical memory because they carry the weight of the African diaspora's traumatic past. Collectively and individually, their lives testify to the multifaceted legacies of enslavement and attempts by captives to dismantle the slave system without suppressing the system's most violent and horrific truths. The recovered pasts of enslaved Black women underscore the competing interest involved in remembering, constructing, and commemorating their lives. So I draw some inspiration today from my colleague at UC Irvine, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, not Ghanaian, Kenyan, but I think that the point is still valid. He says, African memory does not disappear quietly into the good night. It mounts resistance in both the African continent and the diaspora. So as I said to you, this is a paper that kind of manifested itself kind of without my permission. So don't look for a thesis. Don't look for a thesis, just go with me and we'll see where we end up. So Charity Folks, as I said, is a ghost of slavery who, while she's in company with well-known other individuals that were what we call ghosts of slavery, she's not as well known. She's not as well known. Charity Folks was an enslaved woman enslaved in Annapolis, Maryland at the time of the American Revolution. She petitioned for her own freedom. She was able to secure freedom for herself, her children, and her grandchildren. So here was an African-American woman, probably only 2 generations removed from Africa, who was able to secure freedom for several generations of her family prior to the end of the Civil War. Charity Folks has much in common with some of the well-known African Americans from Maryland, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, but who she's most linked to, if you believe the story of family history, if you believe the story of Alex Haley's ancestor, Kunta Kinte, if you believe he was a real person, you will see that actually Charity Folks and Kunta Kinte share a past, either fictive or imagined. Here is the advertisement that usually accompanies any kind of conversation about roots, Alex Haley's roots, and it talks about the ship that they believed Kunta Kinte came to America on. If you go right down, you can see a cargo of choice, healthy slaves, et cetera, et cetera. John Rideout and Daniel St. Thomas of Jennifer owned this ship. John Rideout is also the person who owned Charity Folks. So you see that Charity Folks is very important to understanding how we think about the kind of societies that could be created in the New World, but also the ways in which things were very close. Things were very close to one another. So when I started this project, to me it made complete sense that Charity Folk was from the Gold Coast, perhaps Benin, but definitely my vote was for the Gold Coast. And this map is just taken from a national public, I forgot what I was gonna say. So anyway, this was taken from a heritage site. We know a little bit about Charity Folks. Like I said, she was probably two generations removed from Africa. She was raised on the governor's plantation in Bowie, Maryland. There's examples of different artifacts that were found, buttons, sticks, twine, that were buried under the main floor of the house that Charity was enslaved in and that she, cleaned, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see when they're linked together, they form actually a cosmogram. And cosmograms we know were often to protect people and in some cases put spells on others. Charity Folks also shared, in some ways, let me go back. Charity Folks also shared notions of freedom with most notably the Akan in terms of community versus individual freedom. Charity Folks was well used to the concept of freedom, manumission being a theme that happened both on the Gold Coast and as people arrived in the New World. So slavery wasn't obsolete. Slavery wasn't all-encompassing. Even though it was permanent, there were ways in which enslaved people could work their ways out of slavery. This is just a picture of Charity Folks in Annapolis. I'm going to jump ahead so that I can get really to the meat of why we're here today. This is not a picture of Charity Folks. This is her daughter, Charity Folks Bishop. There's no known image of Charity Folks. That's why I call her a ghost, both literally and metaphorically. And this is a picture of Charity Folks Bishop's gravestone in the Annapolis Cemetery. So that's where I thought that this story ended. I visited the gravestones of Charity's daughter and where I thought Charity Folks was buried, and it was a beautiful family history story. That's where I thought the story ended. But Charity Folks had an afterlife that I was not ready for. Charity folks made our way to Ghana. The University of California, Irvine collaborated with the University of Ghana, Legon, and the National Dance Ensemble. Here is myself with my colleague, S. Amare, who many of you may know. Here I am telling the story of Charity Folks. This was in 2010. I'm still telling the story of Charity Folks. Again, I thought the story was over. I turned it into the press, end of conversation. Nope, Charity Folks has taken us to Ghana. Charity Folks also was insistent that the book wasn't done because I hadn't reached out to her descendants. So I found myself looking for her descendants in the 21st century, the way everyone looks for descendants and people now. Not Ancestry.com, I looked on Facebook. Believe it or not, found her, tracked her down. She and her family joined me in Maryland. I showed her where I thought Charity Folks was buried. And we spent the weekend kind of going through Annapolis and going through the family's history. Charity Folks also went to Irvine, California. This is the way life works. These are Charity Folks' descendants, and the youngest girl, who isn't even in this picture, they actually had a program, the UCI HBCU project, and one of Charity's descendants, wouldn't you know, ended up coming to UCI and doing a program with a friend of mine. So Charity Folks is everywhere. She's ever present, even though a book has been done on her, and I thought I was closing the chapter. When Ghana Calls, W.E.B. Du Bois' famous poem, I often say that I don't plan to go to Ghana, Ghana calls me. And every time it's for a particular reason. So this summer, I thought I was starting my second book. On slave dungeons, African women in slave dungeons. I started the process of going around to slave dungeons, looking at the archaeology, but then eventually going into the actual archive. That's how I started last summer. Then I started writing the paper for this conference, and things happen. Minding my own business, I realized that the ghosts of slavery were starting to speak again. Jessica Marie Johnson, in her very important article about slavery studies, life and death, and marked bodies, talks about the ways in which one enslaved man named Neptune was beaten horribly by those people who owned him, and he didn't stop screaming even as he was dying. And I think the ghosts of slavery are a metaphor for the way in which slavery's historical memory haunts both the United States and Ghana. It's that unspoken yet acknowledged truth. So I was minding my own business. I had already packed. I was on my way here. And I get a phone call from yet another descendant. Hey, Jessica. Thought you would like to know. Looks like I have 2 DNA matches to Benjamin Tasker Jr., who I assumed was Charity Folks' father, a white man, a very well-propertied white man. So she goes on to say, it appears the scholarly guess was right. I had asserted that Charity Folks most likely was the product of rape. Her mother was raped by Benjamin Tasker Jr. Some local Maryland historians got a hold of me literally at the archive and ran me down, telling me, how is that possible? This man was homosexual. Well, violence comes in a lot of forms. So then she says, hey, you want to see some of my DNA records? I said, sure, because I knew the match was going to be the Gold Coast. How could it not be? I knew it. You can't read this, but I can. But basically, their family's matches are Cameroon, Benin, so I wasn't that far off. Fulani, basically anything but Ghana. So I was crushed. This was like 2 or 3 days ago. And I said, no, I'm still not accepting it. Even though this is not just one, but I actually have 2 family records that say that there's no tie to the Gold Coast. I still don't believe it. 3/4 of all people that were shipped to the New World were shipped through Cape Coast or Elmina. I'm just going on the thing that there's got to be some connection. I don't know what it is. That's why I chose to come to this conference, this day, this scene of departure, and say, help. Most scholars, we like to present information when it's all well thought out. We know the answers. I got nothing. I thought they were from the Gold Coast. So I went to our friends slavevoyages.com, which is basically the child of the great slave trading database. I looked furiously at shift manifestos. I tried to have something to bring here today to say, science was wrong. So I told this story because I want us to think about several ways in which heritage tourism and these ghosts of slavery continue to inform us even when we don't realize it. So one of the key questions is going to be in this 23andMe moment, will DNA results impact heritage tourism to Ghana? Now that people can actually locate where they are from in ways that we couldn't do 10 or 20 years ago, what does that mean when someone is coming home to Ghana, but their home is actually somewhere else on the continent? Are other countries as proficient in their remembering or restoring of those who are taken? Have other countries, we know, for example, Senegal and the door no return, there are some places that are more able to do this kind of, I was just talking to Rachel about this earlier, about this kind of justice, this restorative justice. Another question, what happens when this science upends not just a scholar's intuition, but what happens when this DNA science, if we think about the social life of DNA, looking at Londra Nelson, what happens when it also upends a family's oral tradition? Who do we believe? We should also think about, what does the slave trading database conceal? What does it reveal? And how many others call out to be found and heard and seen? So I will end today with this picture of what I believe to be the grave site of Charity Folks. There is no headstone for her, but she sits in the middle of a family plot in Annapolis, Maryland. She has her husband and her daughter, her husband on one side of her daughter on another side of her. These are generations that were in slavery, but she worked to get everyone free. So Charity Folks probably thought very little about what she was doing in the moment, beyond setting up a better foundation for her family, for the generations to come. Charity Folks' family goes on to be the first of a lot of things. Prominent in the medical field, prominent in the Episcopal Church, and prominent for those New Yorkers, if there are any New Yorkers here. One of her descendants actually bought the building that now the very famous YMCA is in. So her family, her own diaspora spread out. Her diaspora is also spread out in Liberia. Why do I end with Charity Folk? Because Charity Folks is one of those ghosts that, even though I knew I was coming to do a conference on Ghana and not on Maryland, she continued to kind of peck at me. She has been relentless. I've been associated with Charity Folks for the last 20 years. She is not content with being a footnote. She calls back from the past, asking us to learn more, to inquire more, to push more. And even when we're going to present on something completely different about departure and return, she asks us to go back to her. So I like to think that as much as Charity Folks is restless and pushing me to find more answers about her life, for the most part, she's found peace. She's surrounded by members of her family. She's in some ways, this enslaved legacy to the freed people that never would ever know slavery. And she seems to call out from the past in all of her forms, as a ghost, as a mother, as someone who's persistent, someone who used the legal system, an ethnicity we're not sure of. But she seems to call back from the past and say, despite it all, we are still here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I want to anchor my introduction in my brother's conclusion, or at least a theme for next year, July's program in Tamale, which is Crossroads of Ghana at Crossroads. Indeed, the museum in Cape Coast Castle has always carried a theme, crossroads of people, crossroads of trade, and I often add crossroads of ideas. So it's in order to have that, and I wish to mention that. But today's theme is returning through the door of no return, which is quite impossible, but it is possible in Ghana. And indeed, in the 1980s, many African countries or developing countries identified tourism as an economic activity to improve their economics, their And Ghana identified heritage tourism as an opportunity to increase its economic gains. And so people have migrated out of Africa since time memorial. I'm sure we all know, you just mentioned it, that people from Africa traveled, landed here first and moved on. UNESCO estimates that over 25 million Africans were dispersed during the transatlantic slave trade. And currently, over 42 million black people live in the US alone. That's from the 2009 statistics. But I'm sure it's even more now that population is expected to increase. The African Union defines diaspora and African as a people of native African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship, nationality, and who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and the building of the African Union. Indeed, the door of no return witnessed the separation of fathers from children, wives from husbands, brothers from sisters, uncles and nephews, and African captives from over 100 tribes with different customs and dialects were dispersed throughout the world, and many describe it as the largest human migration in history. The process of enslavement led to the destruction and the disintegration of the African family system. And many families that have been intact for generations along the Atlantic coast were forcibly separated forever. The 400 years of slavery had a very devastating effect, not only on the family system, but also the love for identity of its people. The majority of the captives were very young. The average age was between 13 and 30. And the process of their confinement in the dungeons, that's dehumanizing them, reducing them to slavery, forced many of them to forget about the customs and culture, and leading to the source of the loss of their cultural values. And indeed, I'm sure you are familiar with the song Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound That Saved the Savior, a wretch like me. This was composed by John Newton, who was a slave merchant. And according to him, many times as he traveled on the coast with captives, he heard them sing or chant some sounds in the deck. And musicologists call this the West African sorrow chants. And according to him, this inspired him to put words to the song. So if you have the opportunity to visit the Library of Congress, it is recorded that the words of that song was written by John Newton, but the melody was unknown. Why is it unknown? Because the captives were stripped of their identity as they crossed the Atlantics from the dungeons. After they've been in slavery and in captivity for many years, it's now dawned on them that there's a need to come back home. Indeed, the Jim Crow laws and the brutalities of after slavery movements forced many of them to look back to identify themselves. I'm sure many of you know Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa and Back to Your Roots concept. But very few know of this gentleman by name Chief Alfred Charles Sam, who in 1915 hired a ship from Oklahoma and actually arrived in Sopon, a village close by my town, with 55 Africans who, with agricultural implements and equipment, to establish a farm. Indeed, it was not successful, or many people described it as not successful, but to us, it was a return of our own to our own. And so over the years, Ghanaians have made a conscious effort to reconnect with the aspiring Africans by making Ghana a place of identity and a place of center of Pan-Africanism. And Dr. Nkrumah, as we always know, has been the father of Pan-Africanism in Africa. His association with Marcus Garvey, his association with Padmore, Du Bois, and everyone is well known. In fact, at Ghana's independence, these African Americans arrived, Dr. Alpha Bunch and Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife. And indeed, Dr. Du Bois came to settle in Ghana, died, and is buried currently in Ghana. So Du Bois Center now acts as the connection between Africans. And I often say that Cape Coast Castle served as a point of departure, and the Boys Center serves as a point, an attraction to bring back the Africans in the diaspora. And this was mainly achieved because Nkrumah's words inspired confidence and pride among Africans across the continent, across the world. And the US, Caribbeans, and everybody identified Ghana as the home of Pan-Africanism. Ghana became the Black Star of Africa. The Black Star became a symbol of Pan-Africanism. And Back to My Roots became the slogan of the period. Indeed, recently, the hospitality industry has made it possible for people to travel at ease to visit their roots, hence the roots tourism. But the idea of roots tourism is a symbolic practice identified in many countries and cultures. Roots tourism refers to travel. These are definitions that you can find in the book. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Greeks have a concept they call the kleos mestos, which is the glory of returning. If you read Odyssey's book, you will find that it is a glory to go into a conflict or to go out into an expedition, but a glory to return. And therefore, we see the return of Africans, diasporans, as a glory. Although Ghana is not the only country to experience the transatlantic slave trade, Ghana has more relics of the transatlantic slave trade than any other African country. We have the first of the St. George's Castle, the first of the forts and castles built in Ghana. Ghana has over 21 of such, but our time will not permit me to show you all, so I'll show you only 3 of these. This is the St. George's Castle in Elmina, the Cape Coast Castle in Cape Coast, and then we have the Christiansborg Castle. All these facilities have established guided tours for the Africans and everybody who visits Ghana. Indeed, Ghana, as I said, Ghana has about 21 forts and castles. It's the largest landmark with the largest collection of monuments depicting the slave story. It has become a center of research into slavery. In fact, many people visit Ghana to research, not only Africans in the diaspora, but Europeans and Ghanaians, and everybody visits Ghana. People do come to Ghana to do videos and documentaries. The resistance movements in Ghana, particularly the story of the Comanche slaves, the Ashanti Kingdom and its wars with the British people, the John Conning. I'm sure many people do not know about John Conning, but he was one of the soldiers who fought against the Dutch, particularly in the Western region. There's a festival on him in the Caribbeans. The Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism, Ghana's independence being the first in the sub-region, and Du Bois Memorial Center identified Ghana with the diasporan public. And therefore, the diasporans look back to Ghana. In fact, to support this, Ghana has an emblem that many diasporan Africans have adopted, known as the Sankofa, which we can find. Move that. This is what we can see there. It's a mythical bird that stretches its neck to pick an egg, which symbolically interprets that it is not a taboo to go back and take what has been left or discarded. And therefore, Ghana continues to attract people of such kind. So what is home, and how do diaspora Africans understand it when its physical location has been destroyed, erased, or forgotten? Indeed, identifying with a place involves developing a deep knowledge of the place and establishing a friendship that can be linked to that place of identity, and the willingness to understand the history of the place and to identify with it. And so if I came to Sharjah and I feel that I identify with it, the interest in its history and culture can make me identify Sharjah as my home. And I already do, because I do have a lot of communities with the Sharjah, and I like it. And so the willingness of the place, the willingness to understand the history of the place and to identify with it also means that the place of identity must develop the facilities to provide education for the understanding of its history and culture to the people who are interested in coming. That's when demand meets supply, and that's what Ghana has done well, and I'm going to share with you. So Ghana developed its museum education and guided tours, developed cultural immersion programs, naming ceremonies, cultural performances, social and public events, business opportunities for people of the diasporan Africans who want to come back home and establish themselves. And that's a section of our museum with the theme, Crossroads of People, crossroads of trade and often at the crossroads of ideas, because the people did not just pass through it, they exchanged ideas. And so guided tours are conducted daily, irrespective of the holidays and public, whatever it is. Guided tours are short, except the break in the COVID that stopped us. And so Ghana also developed professional people to handle visitors who came in. And that's me as a young person, younger than this. I didn't have the white beard out there. But then, that's a very top US official that has visited us. And then also, there's a king from Zambia who also visited us. And then that's Kofi Annan and his family visiting us. These are guided tours that we conduct daily for people. And so through the door of no return has now become the door of return. And the African diaspora family retains a deep sense of pain and loss, but they still identify with it, that it's a place where they can remember their ancestors and the struggle they went through and the gains of returning, the pleasure of returning. So many people come through it, and it's a very emotional situation. I don't want to go into that, but it's a very emotional period when people go through the portal. Indeed, in 1998, 2 bodies of ex-slaves were exhumed in America and brought back through the door of no return to reverse the trend of no return, so that the descendants of the survivors will come back. So these are some of the conscious efforts that Ghanaians have put in place to invite African diasporans back to Ghana, and it has become a place of memorial. And so we often have these scene candles and matches lighted up in the place. In everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, I want to at this time hold a memory for them here in there. May those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this. This is placed at the entrance of the main male dungeons. As you go into the male dungeons, there's a plaque that greets you. And as you come out, we console people with this. And so some cultural immersion programs, there's some of the programs that people come through, lighting candles, and then also they feel a spiritual attachment. In fact, as they broke away from their homeland, the loss of spiritual identity was so stressful that when they come back, they realize that they have returned. And it is very important that they go through that ceremony to reassure them of some of the ceremonies they went through. These are a group of African Americans who have arrived and are interested in renaming themselves. So we take them to a chief who meets them and gives them a name. We first take care of their day names. Some of them don't even know the days they were born. They know their dates. But in Ghana, we deal with names, days of the days you were born. So, for instance, I was born on a Sunday, so I'm Kwesi, and that's what we have for them. And sometimes we assign them to specific families in the communities. President Obama and his family visited in 2009, and they in the dungeons. After, they also unveiled a plaque, and I think this was a strong statement to the diasporan African family that Ghana is the home of diasporan family. And so, going through the door of no return, he gave a statement and says, this part of the statement that he released after the tour. As African Americans, obviously, there's a special sense that on the one hand, this place was a place of profound sadness. On the other hand, it is here where the journey of much of the African American experience began. And symbolically, to be able to come back with my family and see the portal through which the diasporan began, but also be able to come back here in celebration with the people of Ghana of the extraordinary progress that we have made, I think is a source of hope. It reminds us that as bad as history can be, it's also possible to overcome. And I think this statement endorsed Ghana as a gateway to Africa or gateway back home. And so that's a statement of endorsement from the public, and top government officials continue to visit and identify with Ghana. That's a top official from the ministry, the Agric department of whatever ministry, or is it ministry or consulate or whatever it is from the United States. We have Celesi Kaunda also visiting, and then that's the group of African Americans in the naming ceremony that I showed you. These groups of friends, these two friends are friends of mine, and they also always identify themselves as suffering in Ghana. They're enjoying themselves so much that they constitute that as suffering. And they find Ghana as a home and travel and enjoy themselves just as we do, as everybody. And so diaspora Africans, to heal the emotional and psychological trauma and experiences, Ghana has established a lot of events that have identified or cease to manifest and establish their year, to return. And so Panafest is an event that is celebrated biannually to attract or to provide African Americans with the opportunity to visit home. The Emancipation Day is celebrated every year on the 1st of August. And then recently, the last year, we had the Year of Return. That's the shirt I'm wearing now. We have the Joseph Project that have been passed some year ago. And then beyond, now we are in the Beyond the Return program. And so Panafest, we have the Women's Day, many other programs, Children's Day, we have the Youth Day, and many others. There's a piece of, I wanted to play this video for you to see the procession of, if you can help me, the procession of African diasporans who have visited Cape Coast to participate in the, it's a video, can you? No, it's not on YouTube. It's on the, okay, you're going to put it onto YouTube? No, it's not on YouTube. It's on my, listen. It's on my present, yeah. So you, yeah. So this was just last year. And you can see the multitude of people who have visited Ghana. I took this through one of the canon points. That opening was the location of one of the cannons that was directed into the town to quell any resistance or any attempt by the local people to attack the castle, which was quite sometimes often. Good. And so, when they converge at the entrance of the castle, go back, my friend. Yeah.
We come on this journey as the journey of many of us and many of our ancestors who marched in the liberation struggle and the freedom struggle. And tonight we come to ask you, Nana, if you and your elders will lead us into the dungeons.
That's the executive secretary for Panafest.
So that we can pay tribute to our ancestors. We know that ordinarily we do not disturb them in the night, but we're asking you and the elders that we may petition them that tonight is in their honor, that we are not disturbing them but paying tribute to them. And we're asking you to lead us, Nana, lead us with your elders into this castle dungeon, that we may pay due tribute to our ancestors, and that all of us will come here today. We don't just travel with our own feet, but we travel with the feet, the heart, and the soul of all Africans who died in the struggle of liberation, who died for freedom, who died for their people.
So we converge at the forecourt, the courtyard of the Cape Coast Castle for a vigil and candlelight programs. And In 2018, this group of people also did a DNA test and came to reveal it at the door of no return. I'm sure you can recognize some of the actors in it.
Some months ago, or weeks ago actually, not even months, they took our test because they wanted to know where they're from. And what I usually tell people is that we as Black Americans and people in the diaspora,
And such moments are always emotional.
but as we've been here and everyone's been teaching us and talking to us about legacy and resilience.
Yeah.
Our return, it struck me that not only are we victims of Black
Yes.
but you and Tam, you ladies, are the descendants of people who came through these types of wars. And you didn't get to know their name. And you didn't get to know their language.
Revelation that is taking place to inaugurate the year of return and to go through the door of return, inaugurating this year that will be historic in and of itself of the year of return, Ghana 2019. So our new revelating, revealed,
And as we say,
that have
Akwaba.
that will lead us through this door of return, Akwaba.
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 And so Ghana has become the center of people coming to Ghana to identify with themselves. And in fact, the word Akwaba comes from two words, which means Ako, Abba. You have gone and come back. It's not a one word. It's a concept that shows that Africans, the whole world, we are all connected. We are all linked by genes. And therefore, if I don't even know you, never met before, our grandparents' genes know you. They have been together several years. And for we are all one people. So when we meet anybody, we say Akwaba, Ako, Abba. It's a welcome for all of us. And therefore, Ghana has dedicated itself to find out the full story of the transatlantic slave trade and making sure that its true African story is told by Africans. And Ghana set up a multi-sectorial committee to research and trace the slave routes and many things. And so Ghana continues to attract not only diasporan Africans, but all people of slavery descent. And I'll leave you with this. Thank you very much.
All right. So thank you. I want to echo the thanks to all of the organizers for the chance to share today. This is my second time in Sharjah, so I was here for the Global Africa Conference in 2019. So this is, for some people, I feel like I have to tell you this is related but different. When I was here the last time, I presented on a Back to Africa movement that's perhaps already been mentioned in the last talk, led by Chief Sam, but also Reverend Taylor. They were Gold Coasters and cousins by marriage. They brought the first generation of African Americans to Ghana in 1915. When I was in Ghana in 2019, I like to call this the original year of return, not because they were the first diasporans to return by any means, but because they were the first to package it in a kind of capitalist corporate framework, making a lot of media publicity to invite people to invest in stocks in their companies. So in that sense, it bears a lot of resemblance to the more recent year of return in terms of its spiritual and economic ambitions. And as a descendant of Sam's myself from Anamabo, I was also intrigued by two Africans leading this call for diasporic return. Sam on the left, who traveled across the US, promising to manage all of the logistics of getting to the Gold Coast while Taylor was priming local chiefs and religious leaders to receive migrants in their villages. This house is actually Reverend Taylor's family house, and this was the first stop, not many people know, of the migrants in Cape Coast. Last fall, I actually began a strenuous search for this house, but the urgency was not about reconstructing a heritage trail for the movement. Instead, I wanted to find living memories of Reverend Taylor and his daughter, Bessie Taylor. I'd learned last summer that Bessie died in the United States a century earlier after traveling to the US with Chief Sam when she was 15 years old during the fundraising stage of the movement. Her life was transformed as she moved to the US and migrants moved to West Africa. Though her death wasn't publicly acknowledged, I wanted to notify her living kin that she had been buried in a grave for the poor in Maine in 1921. Though I didn't fully anticipate the challenge of locating Bessie's kin, nor the possibility that Bessie herself was not a living memory within the family. Not only Bessie, but the memory of this courtyard, the African Americans who arrived there in the movement, and Taylor's role in it, all had disappeared largely due to Bessie. So today what I want to share is, this is the ship, the SS Liberia, that sailed to Salt Pond, Cape Coast and then Salt Pond. So what I want to share today is the process of planning a belated funeral for Bessie and the way I arrived at that house. In the process, my research practice was altered quite a bit. Perhaps we can just say it was expanded as I allowed for the spiritual agency of the dead. Because I only have 20 minutes here, I won't spend much time on conceptual frameworks to explain that, but rather focus on the guiding questions and the manner in which they were answered. And then in the Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about implications. So let's begin in June of last year. I had a Fulbright fellowship that was put on ice due to COVID. So after a 2-year hiatus, I was told to prepare for a fall trip to finish the grant or to forfeit it. And at that time, I was myself recovering from a serious illness, and I had experienced multiple deaths in the family, so it actually affected my motivation to research the faint traces of this early 20th century Back to Africa movement. In hindsight, I now see that my disorientation actually created room for me to think deeply about Bessie. I gave myself a week to respond to Fulbright, and if during that week I found something that would reignite my research interests, I would make plans to spend several months in Ghana in the fall. And I actually started somewhat mindlessly by entering Reverend Taylor's name on Ancestry.com because I wanted to see if there were any new records from his travel to Maine. I'd already cataloged Sam fairly extensively, and Ancestry sometimes just randomly, updates new repositories, and the only way you're going to know is if you keep checking the same old names and seeing if new records appear. To my surprise, the first record that appeared last summer was a death certificate for Bessie. Here you can see her father is J.D. Taylor. She died in Maine. No mother is listed. And my researcher antenna at this point really began to vibrate with questions because I recognized J.D. Taylor and I knew Bessie traveled with Sam. I felt obliged to notify her relatives in Ghana. And so all of these questions were on the one hand about my own work, but on the other hand about what we owe to others. So this is a habit of mine because I often bump into records of people who are interested in their distant kin. But this particular death certificate rattled me. If Bessie was born, as it suggested, in 1900, then she couldn't be Taylor's biological daughter. By then, the AME Zion Church had already sponsored his trip to the US with a famous contingent of Africans, including James E.K. Agre and Frank Osam Panenko, formerly Arthur, who were all studying for the ministry in the US. If the date was correct, could she be adopted kin, a servant taken into the family? I knew Taylors had owned slaves and maintained domestics. If she arrived in Maine, was she pawned for Sam or Taylor's religious obligations to a church that they grew attached to outside of AME Zion's knowledge? As an adoptee myself and a product of a very elaborate return journey that I can't summarize here. When I went back at 19, I was sensitive to the ways that fostered children could be moved around on short notice and expected to adapt to unusual situations. So I began to question if Bessie would even want to return to a family that abandoned her, and whether they felt limited, if any, responsibility for her life. Would it be better to mark her grave in Maine? These speculative questions all hinged on the accuracy of this particular death record. So I decided to commit some time leading up to Ghana to resolve these questions, and I decided to return Bessie, if appropriate and if possible, including exhumation and reburial. Now, if that's surprising to you, don't worry, because my sense of possibility always rests on whether or not somebody agrees when I ask. So I try to ask first and see what happens. If it didn't work or it didn't seem right, I would have accepted that. But if we take seriously the spiritual agency of the dead, then this work was not mine alone. I saw myself as an aid to Bessie, who had surfaced with uncanny timing on the centennial of her death and on the cusp of a reluctant trip to Ghana. With my unusual knowledge of her family and that generation and this scheduled trip, I felt obliged to investigate. Now, I was also aware of the fact that Sams and Taylors had intermarried, adopted, and given up children for generations. I considered her kin to me if she was a moving piece in this family epic. When I returned to Ghana in the 90s to meet my birth family, I was renamed Ekua Sam, and that renaming felt useful in this moment, because if a Sam had brought her to the US, surely a Sam could bring her home. So as I show some materials for the funeral later, if you see Ekua Sam, you know that's also me. I began to consult with archaeologists, several archaeologists, about the material and ethical process of returning African remains. I don't know if Rachel is sitting, but we had some very thoughtful conversations that really deepened my understanding about the ethics of exhumation. She had really pushed me to think about why we return remains, particularly how graves are kept or neglected in Ghana. Is this process meant to soothe our own conscience or actually help the dead rest? Who will receive her and who will recognize her return? So I made these questions part of a long list and tackled each one. At each point, again, I was willing to let Bessie rest in Maine if return was not meaningful from the standpoint of her own life experiences. Within a week, which is rather fast for research, I had learned that Bessie was buried in a South Portland cemetery in plot I-402, a section designated for the adult poor. She lived in a children's hospital for a year and a half before she died after the Bible school where she lived for 7 years was disbanded. The church memoirists who wrote about their experiences in this Maine commune never mentioned Bessie, despite her living there for so long. Fortunately, the archivist, this is the Bible school, and this is Reverend Sanford. This was an Anglo-Zionist sect. This is a group of people who did not work for wages. They basically asked all members to turn over all their assets upon joining the church, which is how they built this large structure. However, there was no heating in the rooms. There was very little furniture. They had trouble sustaining it. So by 1920, the children who lived there were living on cornmeal, and the state disbanded it. So fortunately, I was able to get in touch with archivists who had cataloged materials associated with this church and Bible school, and they sent me a photo of the students who attended there in 1914. Now, keep in mind that Bessie had arrived in 1913, so I decided to zoom in on every face, looking for one that was darker than the others, and I spotted Bessie. By this point, she had lived there for a year, and the photo was taken 1 month after Chief Sam had departed on the SS Liberia. She stood with a balled fist and erect posture, socially distanced from the other students. She certainly lived there despite her absence in public accounts. Within another few days, I learned that our family's history of intermarriage with the Taylors was sufficient to authorize disinterment of a century-old grave. And by mid-August, I launched a crowdfunding campaign to cover the costs of exhumation, reburial, and memorialization in Maine and in Ghana. And thankfully, we were able to raise almost $10,000 in 3 weeks. I didn't think that was going to happen, by the way, and I was actively investigating my retirement account. So I'm grateful I did not have to liquidate. But it was only, and I will say here that at this point in time, I did not know that August 15th, the date that I launched the fundraiser, was her actual birthday. I only learned that later in Ghana when I saw her baptismal certificate. She was born August 15th, 1897, and she was Taylor's biological daughter. But before we had that information, I took the exhumation seriously as both a rite of return and a source of information. While preparing to open the grave, we made a list of things we expected to find there. Things like, pieces of her curved spine. She contracted tuberculosis and had it for so long that it entered into her bones. She had a very curved back, and she was paralyzed in the legs by the time she died. We anticipated finding molars that would hold the history of her diet as a child compared to the cornmeal she lived on in Maine. I personally anticipated that a cloth would be there, the cloth her father wore and gifted to Reverend Sanford in 1902 as a piece of valuable collateral, a sign that he would return. This was the only tangible promise that Bessie might have held on to. But on the day of the dig, we were in for a surprise. The shovel hit cement, which was not what we expected. A cement vault would have been a very expensive means of preservation for a pauper's grave in 1921. Once the lid was off, the wood coffin lay there intact, too large for Bessie's curved body. After lifting the planks, it became obvious that this was not Bessie in the coffin, but a black man who likely died in the 1960s. Asia Lands, who was an archaeologist working at Harvard, had come to identify the remains and oversee the exhumation, so we were able to find out these features from looking at his skull and some other features in the grave. The cemetery had no idea who this man was. They denied segregated burials and considered it likely that Bessie was underneath in a small coffin or a shroud, sunken over the years until the soil made way for another layer of coffins to be laid on top without record. I was personally devastated, perhaps so much so that the force of my disappointment compelled them to give me a refund. They didn't deliver the body, and they didn't see anything wrong with that. But I'm sure after an hour of me speaking firmly to them, they got the point. And, at that point, I'll be honest that I almost felt that the project was a failure and I should refund everybody the money, but my brother insisted that we continue because we still had work to do. An hour north, where the commune was, to install a cenotaph at the church cemetery. This is the church cemetery on the left. Now, Bessie was denied burial in this cemetery in 1921, so our desire was really to place some kind of marker there to signal her presence. A cenotaph means the body is not here, and I'd hoped it would point the way to Ghana, but the failure to collect her remains still made me uneasy. I'll say here that the dates you see on the right, 1898, actually comes from a 1920 census in which Bessie herself gave information about her year of birth. It's still not accurate, it's 1 year off, but she says her parents are fancy and she was born in 1898. A few days after this particular journey, I actually woke up with a new attitude, as they say, because I began to think about the soil. In the poor lot where Bessie was buried, I had collected soil to memorialize the situation. Her body buried underneath a man she didn't know. We wondered if her spirit was somehow stuck in that way, or if the exhumation experience was another way to communicate to us the challenge of return. Stacking graves was a practice that the cemetery initially denied, and it was only the exhumation that proved it happened. So I decided to continue the journey to Ghana and to consult a traditional priest, someone who specializes in restless spirits and bodiless burials. This is Nana Komfo Kojo Odum, who has since transitioned himself. He was a traditional priest of Wiomwa, which is on the edge of Cape Coast. I was introduced to him by the Queen Mother, herself also a tailor, born in England. She identified with Bessie's story, and this would happen over and over again once I got to Ghana. Various aspects of Bessie's story and even my own return to Ghana as an adoptee reunited with birth family would resonate with others and begin to crack some of the normative narratives of family that we are compelled to tell. So Nana Kojo met us at dawn around 4:30 in the morning to allow us to formally request advice about Bessie's funeral. The Okomfo is a medium who channels the spirit of the village, and to fulfill our request, the spirit would have to agree to cross the ocean to look for part of Bessie, the part that remained in the US. This was a venture, not a promise. We were fortunate that Nana Kojo was a talented medium. He was very willing to try. As he explained it, the spirit travels through soil, water, and electrical currents, so it was possible to take the soil that we had brought and infuse it with Bessie's spirit after the ritual for the purpose of reburial. That means it would function as ashes when we put it in the ground. On the second day, he channeled Bessie's fragmented consciousness from behind a white sheet in a windowless room, ringing a bell and speaking in an altered voice while sharing aspects of her experience that we had not spoken to him about. After an hour, he then infused the jar of soil with Bessie's integrated spirit to consecrate reburial. Despite the significance of this encounter and the sense of closure it produced, I still had very practical and nagging questions. What should we do about the father's family? We had a mass of tailors invited, but they were all seeming to conceal the right tailor. What about the mother's people? What kind of funeral would it be if they were not present? These were, okay, I'll come back to this. In response to those questions, Nana Kojo said, through Bessie's fragmented consciousness, I will go back to my father's house after the funeral. We were told to focus our efforts on the month-long process of wake-keeping, that is visiting descendants of known family and friends, finding her mother's clan and a chief to represent her at the funeral, giving Bessie a royal burial on the anniversary of her death, October 24th, and burying her next to family. That last point, I'll talk about in a minute. So fortunately, we were refunded those cemetery fees after the botched exhumation because this burial was not cheap. For those of you who know, Ghana burials are a multi-day process, and the price can quickly rack up. So I was grateful in that moment for something that devastated me earlier, which is that we had the resources to actually neutralize the biggest obstacle to conversation with tailors. If you approach a family and you say someone has died and you may have some obligation to bury them, they will not be interested in the financial obligations. But because we had already covered the costs, they were able to be more open and candid about some of the complicated facets of their family history. This funeral poster you see here, you can see is quite common, of course, in Cape Coast, inviting the public to attend, and of course that means you get a free meal, so it's easy to get people to come to your funeral. My intention here was also to create, in addition to, I'll explain this image on the right in a second, because I wanted to create a more three-dimensional sense of Bessie for people to connect with her more intimately. I had considered let's go back here. So I had considered including a grave sculpture, something on the left, to stand in for her body above ground. But, you know, traditional and Christian death practices don't always coexist easily in the church. So to merge the two, I drew a portrait of Bessie, you see this in the middle, and as she might have looked. This is taken from a youthful portrait of her, the one I showed earlier, and aged up in some sense. And I gave the drawing to Ray Agbo, who's a sculptor, and he created on the right a sculpture for the altar. So in turn, that bust was then dressed with fancy funeral jewelry as a substitute for the dressed body. I think here you can see, on the right is my grandmother's wake in 2019. You can see similar funeral jewelry. And on the left, you see one from 1910. So we reinserted Bessie into a cultural tradition that would have been legible to her then and is still used today. And this was jewelry on loan from, you know, a queen mother in town, and then this was the permanent jewelry after the service. We also had a series of tributes that were delivered to recreate the context for Bessie's social milieu at the time and family relationships, as well as creating space to talk about practices that separate families. Kennedy Apri is standing there next to me, the third picture. Delivered the Cape Coast tribute. Nenekria Pietzoa II, she's the Queen Mother. She's in the first picture. She spoke about people who travel abroad for education and work who for various reasons cannot return. I spoke about pawnship and theft from the coast. Kennedy spoke about pawnship and theft from the coast. Also memories of family that are buried elsewhere that maybe sometimes children ask about people who have disappeared and those questions are left unanswered. I also spoke about illness and premature death that leaves people like Bessie without direct descendants. So the funeral really opens space for discussing very difficult subjects across generations, and many people approached me later. On the right, you see Sarah Taylor after the service to speak about what it would mean to start redoing moments when a funeral should have happened. And this is more about, so drummers dancing, but it's more about the dual aspect of welcoming someone home while also acknowledging this very much delayed return. Oh, I've got to speed up, so let me keep going, because we're getting to the important part. Okay, so I'll just say this is the Reverend, and he had his own kind of pivotal moment at the gravesite. When he saw where Bessie was buried, he asked me how I chose that location, and I simply told him Bessie chose, because there was no rational reason why I could choose one place over the other. And it turned out that Bessie was separated by one tree from her cousin. And so I decided to follow up on that lead and got in contact with the cousin, who then took me across the street and said, there is Reverend Taylor's house, and that is how I arrived at this courtyard. Now, telling the story of a funeral after the fact might have been upsetting for relatives, but in this case, the news of Bessie was a surprise. To Reverend Taylor's descendants, he had no biological children, and their understanding of his life began after Bessie died, concentrating on his later years with the AME Zion Church. You'll see his portrait is actually up there on the right in their living room. This helped me understand the challenge of finding people to recognize Bessie. Taylor's early life had been a mystery. Erasing Bessie had also erased part of Taylor, making it difficult to understand his life choices and his nonlinear career with the church. So I decided to come back with pictures and a funeral book. The language of the living room is really a story in portraits. So I shared a portrait of Bessie that I drew along with her childhood picture. That's the picture I drew, but this is me sharing it along with, in dialogue with their pictures. I also shared a young portrait of Taylor in Kente. These were all new images for Mr. Atta, his grandnephew, who remembered him as a child. And yet it was the portrait of Bessie that gave him pause. As soon as he said it, he said, that's Rose. Rose was his sister, and the resonance between them created an opening to talk about Bessie as a plausible member of the family, and also to explain how unclaimed children often complicate austere reputations, but so much time had passed that they were no longer invested in defending that. So we were able to piece together details from various family members and my own research to understand that Taylor, who had been a school teacher and traveling evangelist, self-appointed evangelist at the time, had a brief affair during one Christmas break with a sister's friend, Abraba Abakuma, and perhaps she was a worker in the house. Her family lived down the street on the road to the castle. We looked at a baptismal certificate together and noted that the two never married, but Taylor's boss, Mr. Graham, was the godfather, who gave Bessie his own surname as her middle name to enable her to move between the Graham and the Taylor families as needed. Bessie's mother died from a tragic fall less than 2 years later. By this time, Taylor was sent abroad by the AME Zion Church to train as a minister. When Abraba Abakuma died, he also fell ill, and one of his teachers passed him a leaflet about faith healing from this Anglo-Zionist church. It's hard to say if Taylor pledged his daughter's life to Sanford's church out of grief or gratitude, or if he had always planned to send her away. After all, Bessie means pledge to God. After Bessie died, Taylor was referred to as a mystic in local papers. He lived, according to them, as the apostles in the New Testament and encouraged others to do the same. And by 1924, the AME Zion Church sent a bishop to appeal for his return because Reverend Osam Panenko was also planning to defect. Taylor and Osam Panenko argued for an African nationalist church free from the American mother church, which had failed to provide sufficient financial support and paths to leadership for Africans. Yet despite the momentum for this new African church, Taylor suddenly dissolved the Church of God and Bible School and rejoined the AME Zion Church in 1925. His church was active for exactly 8.5 years, the same period of time that Bessie lived in the US. Whether she was sacrificed to build his church or pawned, anticipating a growing partnership with Sanford in Maine, we can't know. Regardless of this reasoning, the context for her arrival in 1913 is clear. She landed in the middle of a Back to Africa movement that used the resources of Sanford's church to repair the SS Liberia. She witnessed the ship's departure, likely not knowing that she would never see her family again. So I'll just skip to, this is her grave in Cape Coast, and I'll just skip to the final slide here. The funeral, of course, as other speakers have said, things do not end when you think they'll end. This month, the Ghanaian artist Kofi Sadoji reproduced the cloth that you see in this black and white photo. He was quite moved by the story when I told him last fall, and coming from a family of traditional priests himself, he understood the power of this cloth as a source of value, collateral, and a promise to return. Bessie likely clung to the promise of this cloth, extending her life when most people died from tuberculosis within 2 to 3 years. She survived for 6, spending the last months of her life within sight of the port, perhaps waiting for Sam's ship to return. In this reproduction of the cloth, we're prompted to think about promises that still hang in the air and an understanding of meaningful return that is not only about the historic African diaspora coming back to Ghana, seeking reunion with distant kin, but also those returning to the families from birth under difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Muke Ghana na shi rayuwa na da karfi. Shi ce yayi tafiya. Shi na tuma turiya da jannare. Ina tama da shiganka shi ka samu komai. Amma da na shiga na gan kama suna ne.
I mistake Pancho da sanamba because of humanity.
Obi kwa to ne dan ede ko. Na wonya sa chance ya na wakona waba na de na obese
ba wahala ba mace na bi kan desert na mutu ban mutuwa o ni da bi kai me sa gobe yaro na da bi wannan wahala.
Sunana Fati. Abin da nake son ba yara na da ni ban samu ba, ina son ba su tarbiyya.
Okay, so this is another side of topic of migration I treated in a documentary film titled Fati's Choice. So basically, this woman, out of hardship, wanted to seek greener pastures in Europe, specifically Italy. You see, she was married, she had 5 children, and then managed to go through the desert to Libya and then continued on the Mediterranean to Italy. But upon getting there, things didn't go as it should, as she expected, because she had this anticipation that things will be easier in Europe, she can be able to work and make money, bring it home back to her children and family. So after 6 months at the camp, actually when she was on the Mediterranean, they were arrested, and then kept in a camp for a proper procedure before regularization. But things just didn't go well, and then she decided to come back to her family. So her story didn't end there. She was faced with so much stigma. Family members were expecting that regardless of the situation in Europe, she had to stay there. She had to make sure that all her goals are met. But here is the case that she also has a goal. Fine, she had a goal to go to Europe, but it didn't work out. So she had to come back to Ghana. And the reason why what really motivated me to treat this topic was, migration has always been my topic of interest because growing up, I saw many people from my community travel abroad and never return home. The fear of being labeled a failure was one of the several reasons preventing them from returning. Families had so much expectations because most of the family try as much as possible to make funds available for them to travel. So you are expected to pay that in remittances. At the same time, there's also the angle of status symbol, for the fact that people have families abroad. So there's a lot of pressure on the migrant or the person who is abroad. So those who also made it home, had to go the extra length to impress family, friends, and even the whole community to be recognized as successful, earning them the name Bintus. In the local, we call them Boga. So I wanted to dig deeper into this phenomenon to understand why the returnee is perceived as a failure and why people feel the need to travel to Europe with all the risks sometimes in order to succeed. Is this because of our colonial past where everything Western is perceived as good? My initial objective for the film was to explore the issue of stigma associated with returnees and how society contributes to irregular migration by having a poor judgment of returnee. Because it is expected that when you return, you are supposed to be helped in reintegration. If things don't go out well, at least family members have to help you to begin a new life. But it wasn't like that in Fati's case. So identifying the protagonist actually was very difficult, especially for returnees who are perceived as failures. They are afraid of people judging them, the judgment of not making it. So a lot of them are quiet, some are in hiding, or they are always afraid to mingle with society. So the first person actually wasn't my character. I started off with my cousin, who is also a returnee. He traveled on land to Libya and attempted severally to reach Europe by boat, but was unsuccessful. Through my conversation with him, that's when he mentioned Fati, my character you just saw. And you know, they met in Libya, and how she successfully made it to Italy and couldn't stay. I was intrigued and wanted to know more. When I saw her, you know, I saw a perfect protagonist in her because she stood out as a woman who cherished her independence, made personal decisions, and stand by them, irrespective of the consequences. I was inspired by her story, especially the bold decision to return home, regardless of the inevitable stigma and criticisms that she will face. Now, the challenge here is getting her to participate. She was skeptical about how she will be represented in the story. She was afraid I'll be very judgmental of her decision, like most people have, and simply refused to be on camera. But as a filmmaker, I made her understand my intention to tell stories of people with exceptional experiences and perspectives that could change perceptions and perhaps policies. It took about 6 months of convincing and making her understand that her story is important and inspiring to share with the world. Regardless of the challenges that Fati faces in the film, there's a clear indication that Fati sees her home country, Ghana, as a place of stability and growth for her children. It was not worth risking a life to travel to another country in the name of seeking greener pastures that is non-existent. The unwavering bond between mother and children is strong enough for her to stay, but for her, the enigma and attraction of migration continues, this time within Ghana, from Sekondi to Accra. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to just thank everyone for a really thought-provoking set of presentations. And I know that there will definitely be many questions from the audience, but I wanted to just start off with a round of questions for each one of you, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. So for Jessica, you said something that was quite interesting about the kind of explosion of the DNA industry and the ability of diasporic Africans to actually be able to pinpoint the place or places from which they have ancestry and whether or not that may actually impact the heritage tourism industry in Ghana. And so in some ways that triggered a kind of question for Blankson, which was actually whether or not you've seen that or whether that is articulated as a concern on the part of diasporic Africans, whether or not they can actually trace their heritage to Ghana per se. And then my question for you, Jessica, was actually, I was hoping you might just say a little bit about what you had initially proposed to talk with us about, which is the question of the ways in which as I understood it anyways, this kind of growth of social media in the context of heritage tourism and the way that that functions, and you seem to juxtapose it to the kinds of technologies of death that we face in the diaspora, that Black people face in the diaspora, and sort of bringing those two together into a single analytic frame. And I wanted to hear more about that. I thought it was a really provocative kind of merging of these two different kinds of media platforms. And then for Blankson, in addition to the question I already posed, I think the thing that I really wanted to hear from you, you gave us such a comprehensive kind of overview of both history and what's happening in terms of the castles and what takes place. And it was almost like slightly scientific in a way. There was a sense too of framing it as, I think you said, even supply and demand. And you recognize that there's this demand for a framework to address, or structures to address, heritage tourism, and you are supplying that. And yet, even though there's that kind of, I think, formulaic or scientific language that you're using to frame this industry, and we all know it's an industry, and it's lucrative, but we also know that there are encounters that happen in Cape Coast, in Elmina, in Christiansborg, in all of these places. And you mentioned at one moment that it's very emotional, or a number of times. And I don't necessarily want to ask you to speak on behalf of diasporic Africans about their own emotions, right? But I'm really curious to hear you talk about the ways in which those encounters over so many years that you've been working in these spaces have changed you and what they've meant for you and your colleagues. And I've been with you in those places, and I've seen you lead those conversations. And it strikes me as something that, in as much as you're aware of your own emotions in that space, and you're oftentimes aware of the emotions of those you're standing next to, the pain that is emoted in those places. I often wonder what you feel. So I'd love to hear you talk about that more. And then, so I'm going to give the rest of my questions, and then and then for Ebony, gosh, like where to even begin with such a kind of powerful story. I'm accustomed to sort of thinking about some parts of your work in relationship to biography and to your own autobiography, and to see the kind of extension of some of that into, Betsy's Return. Betsy's Return was really, really powerful. One of the things that you said, and I think this might have come up in your conversations with Rachel, was this question about the ethics of exhumation and reburial. And it sounded like one of the concerns was this question of could the remains be properly buried in Ghana? Would the gravesite be maintained? And it brought me back to the conversations that we had in the panel on repatriation and restitution of looted artworks, right? And the kind of refrain that often comes up, which is these looted goods shouldn't be repatriated back to Africa because African institutions don't have the infrastructure to care for them appropriately, right? This kind of way of manufacturing an argument against that. And so I was thinking about that together, and thinking that it would be great to actually hear a little bit more about the ethics of exhumation and reburial. And I'm also sort of triangulating that with, because I think it was even months before this whole, your effort had taken off, there was the disclosures about the remains of the children from the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia that had migrated from Harvard and then to University of Pennsylvania, and were being used for profit-making online classes and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a whole, I think, kind of minefield. And I'm sure, and knowing you, that you were navigating that, and so I'd love to hear more about that. And then for you, Fatima, I'm such a huge fan of this film. It is so powerful, and I really urge those who haven't seen it yet to watch it. And you spoke a little bit about the process of getting Fatima to trust you, to let you into her life and into her children's life. And I wanted you just to say a little bit more about that, because it was a long process. And one of the things that I love about this film is that, you don't judge her. You show many other people judging her, and you show the way in which she has to absorb all of that. And it's really sort of profound. And one of the things that that I really thought about it as I was thinking about this is, we recognize that you are shining a light on a part of this, departure and return that just we don't talk about, right? Which is, people who are migrating today and who, for whatever reason, come back, and they don't come back with the success that they were looking for. But the phase of contemporary migration today is typically male, right? That's often who we see. And so not only did you bring attention to the story that we don't talk about enough, but you force us to reckon with the female face of migration and the very gendered ways in which Fati experienced the migration, but also the things that pulled her home, right? Her children. And it struck me not as an impossibility that a man might return to because he longed for his children, but the ways in which you were also telling a story about mothers and children and the bonds that they have. And I would just like to hear you talk a little bit more about the kind of gendered story that you're telling. So that's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I loved this panel. Let me just say to my panelists, I loved this panel. Clearly the organizers saw all kinds of threads to weave it all together. So the first question was about the multi-million-dollar business of DNA kits. I have a lot of opinions. The first of which, I think that my first answer when people say, oh, I want to do family history, I got my DNA kit. That's not family history. I believe family history is going where you think your family was or know they were. You walk on those streets, you go into those houses, you talk to people, you do the old school actually collecting family history. And the science then is supposed to back up some of the claims or refute some of the claims. I have my own opinions about African ancestry versus Ancestry.com. I'll just say that it's a multi-million-dollar business. I think that it probably, and this is not substantiated because, I'm a historian, I'm not a numbers person, but I do think during COVID, I received more and more calls about people's families' history and their DNA results because people were sitting at home. What better time to start doing family history and paying your money to these big companies to do DNA results? I think that one of the things that gets lost with DNA results, and I watch Finding Your Roots, for those Americans that watch Finding Your Roots, and there's always these big reveals. There's all these big reveals, but one of the things the science does not do is tell you that social circumstance. That social circumstance of be it either a consensual relationship or a relationship of forced migration. There's so many things that the science does not tell us. So I'm going to stick to history. And I encourage everyone who's going to do their own family history to go do that history and then use the DNA test as kind of a backup or substantiate. Because part of the journey of doing family history, it is a process of self-discovery, right? By healing your family's past, you also are healing yourself. So that's number one. Number two, on a different spectrum, at one point I was going to write or present a part of a paper that I did with a Ghanaian American, and we called it, Did COVID Make Me an Afro-Pessimist? And so then we started thinking about the ways that death was ritualized during COVID. And we started thinking about the ways in which that for some allies, the murder of George Floyd was brand new news. And the ways in which that even that became a performance of guilt and grief, depending on who you were. So originally the paper was going to be about Afro-pessimism, but I'm not an Afro-pessimist. So that's part of the problem. But the story really hinged on a trip when I took students to Cape Coast in 2010, and it was a multiracial group. So it was, you know, I teach at UC Irvine, so that means it's everyone but black people. But there were 3 black students on the trip. And so I, of course, said, I think, you can go in separately. They asked me, could they go in separately? And so I made the mistake of telling my colleagues they were going in separately, and it became a thing. The moral of the story is after this, one of our colleagues that we share, Professor Akosua, called me and said, I get it now. Okay, great, I'm glad you get it now. But the Cape Coast story is that then we went through and our organizer was trying to get us all together, the UCI organizer, not the docent, was trying to get us together to have that picture at the end. You know, you come back from the door of return, you go outside, you look at the fishing boats, and there's a picture. And we weren't feeling the picture. And one of the students said just openly, so you want us to take a picture on a graveyard? And so that was kind of where I was going, and then I realized that really did make me an Afro-pessimist in some ways. So that's just kind of a long kind of look at where I was trying to go in this paper, but your questions were excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you repeat the question briefly? It's been a long time now.
Yeah, so the first one was just quickly, actually, you know what, skip that because I really want to focus on this question of how your work has changed you, how the encounters over these many, many years that you have been bringing all different kinds of people, but in particular diasporic Africans into these spaces, narrating this history, how that has impacted you and how that's changed you over time.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I was born and named Harry Boham Blankson. That's the name my father gave me, Harry Boham Blankson. I took it through school, and when I started working in the castle, I realized that it was a name I cannot even mention in public. I can't use that name in public because the first that hit me was that it was a slave master's name. Harry being an American, British name. Boham was a Dutch anglicized name. Blankson, an anglicized African name. And so the first thing I did was to adopt my own name that I came to the world with, which is the day on which I was born, Kwesi. We have day names. And so and then I was named after my grandfather, who is Esau. And so I said, why don't I adopt my traditional name? Blankson is an anglicized African name, so I'll keep that. And so the first thing that hit me was I change my identity and change my name. So I swore an affidavit. I didn't just change it, I swore an affidavit to change it. That was the first year I started working in the castle. So I changed it to Kwesi Esau Blankson, and that has become my name since. Right? After that, I realized, researching, reading about Africans and their relationships and also their progress in life, we realized that we have been undermined. Our contribution to world civilization has not been recognized. And so we realized that I have to look into the world with a new perspective. And so reading and researching, I realized that we have some qualities that made us who we are. We are strong people. We are healthy people. If you look at the COVID, which came recently, we survived it. In fact, I cannot identify anybody in my family or close to that I had COVID. We have good food, and so I realized that we have been brainwashed over the years with the kind of images that has shown us on the TV and the cinemas and the magazines and in the books and the concepts. So I asked myself, the philosophers, the Descartes and all those, what are they saying? Though Africans also have a philosophy. Going back in time, I realized all these philosophies that have been expounded by these great Greeks were all African philosophies. And in fact, our life is a philosophy. I just mentioned Akwaba as a concept. That says we go back, we are all related, and then through some means we cannot control, we were able to disperse, sometimes willingly, sometimes forcibly. In fact, currently, man is looking for a place to live in space. We are sending spaceships. It's an exploration. Nobody's forcing us out of Earth. People are moving by their own will. And so migration has been part of life. But Africans or Ghanaians, as we know, I realize that we have philosophies and concepts that we can work with and develop. And so looking into that, I said, okay, that's a very beautiful thing. In fact, for over 20 to 30 years, or let me say 22 years since I started working in the castle, this is my first time wearing a coat or suit. This is the first time. And I don't feel even comfortable in it. But because the place is cold. And so I just have to. My appearance in public shows my identity as a Ghanaian. I always try to establish myself as a Ghanaian, as an African, and I'm very proud of that. And wherever I go, I don't hide it. In fact, if you argue with me in public about I may embarrass you. You see? And so meeting all these people, sharing the experience of the transatlantic slave trade with people also got to realize that I was, in fact, more articulate. I do hit the points that most museum educators will not touch. I can tell you for a fact that the words like, if we calculate the man-working hours of Africans who arrived alive in America, Africans will own America. These are some of the words that I used to. I always hate political, economic discourses. And so that people go back arguing. I've left a whole group of people leaving the castle, arguing over lunch, arguing to bed, and coming back to ask questions over the next day. And so I always try to let people argue, discuss the subject, because it's a subject that is old, but it's new in research. A lot of information are missing. We need to piece them together. And so getting people to talk about it gives us the opportunity to learn more. And I've also learned a lot from people who have had the opportunity to do research, just like yourself. We come with information, I want to do this. Following them also, giving me the idea to learn how things are done. I met a lady who is from the Kew University, Kew Museum in London. And he gave me so much information that I realized, we need to change some of the narratives about the presentation in the castle. Let's say that the dungeons, as my African American colleagues will suggest I even say it here, not a castle. And therefore, we realize that people who come to the space, your second question, people who come to the castle dungeons are very emotional. The loss of identity is of a great concern to Africans in the diaspora, having to establish. So the question they ask, why are you here? Why am I there? What happened to you? But the question people forget to, or the issue people forget to look at is, for every person who was taken away, grieved mothers were left behind. Grieved uncles, grieved brothers were left behind. If I went to the farm with my brother and he was taken over and I was able to run home, what kind of psychological or emotional phase am I going to go through? The trauma of the transatlantic slave trade did not only happen on the Atlantics and beyond the ocean. There are families who suffered greatly. A breadwinner goes to the farm or to the market and it's taken away. You sleep before you realize you are on the chains with your children on the farm. You go ahead a bit, you see your father who was taken 2 weeks ago, dead on the path that you're also going. Are you going to survive this? All these trauma, people also who stayed back also got to know. And so you realize that people here, although some Africans connived, because that issue comes up. Africans sold us. So you sold me, your brother, your uncle sold my uncle. Your grandfather sold my grandfather. You understand? So you realize, no, there's a misconception. There's a false information that has been sent out today. So we need to find out all these things and discuss them. And so leaving people in the discussing after the tour, it becomes a very healthy way of visiting the place. And people have enjoyed it so far, and I'm happy to be part of that.
Thank you. Ebony?
You're right. I've given a lot of thought to that question about why exhume. And I guess I learned a lot too. So my initial impulse was to balance the desire for return, feeling it as an automatic obligation if possible, which is a common discourse among people that I was talking to in the early days, that, oh, if you can take her home, you should take her home. And then really doing more reading, having more conversations with archaeologists, really helped me think deeply about these questions in the US versus the way the question can be answered in Africa. So in African American archaeology, the question of what to do with African remains often revolves around community-driven questions. So what does the community want? Is this a burial ground that is specifically for Africans? And what I was dealing with was one grave of one African girl that was detached from community. And so the question of exhumation and return was already quite different. So even though the preservation of African American cemeteries in the US is against exhumation for very good reasons today, in large part to, I think, stall what is a land grab of cemetery space that is targeted for development, and to force a more direct accountability of cities and towns to deal with the fact that people are buried there. So that's happening in Philadelphia now. So I understood those questions to be very specifically about community questions of mass burial sites. But dealing with an individual grave of someone who is separated from community, the question then became, can you return her to a community that will recognize her? And so then it was about, can you do enough research to find out exactly where she was born and belonged? And in the early stages, I have to say, many people doubted that I could find out much about her at all. And I was just, I don't know, quite convinced that if you keep asking, something will happen. So we were able to find out much more information than, let's say, an archaeologist typically has about African remains. So I had much more biographical information, many more clues. And what I had to balance was the research question around remains. Do you simply take the remains and return them, or are you trying to study them for some particular reason, and what is the threshold of study that tips into violation of remains? So we had a lot of conversations about, do you study the spine, the bones? Do you take samples from the skull? Which I said no. But I was willing to say, let's study a molar, because you can get those distinctions in early versus late diet, and that would enrich the biography that we could tell about her. So my threshold was, whenever we could add to her biography in a meaningful way, then sure. But if this is just for research about, let's say, tuberculosis in African girls, which is what was presented to me at one point, I said, no, I'm not interested in telling a story about tuberculosis in that way, because it was, in some sense, an effort to create a regional story about race and tuberculosis, as opposed to the actual story of her catching tuberculosis in a religious commune where she was the only black girl. So the story that you would tell wouldn't match up to her actual experience, but it would be put in a pool of data, right, that would work against her life. So those were the kinds of distinctions I was making about what you would do with remains. And then when we actually uncovered this man, I felt a strong obligation. Even then, my brother and I actually went to the AME Zion Church locally because that was the only black church in Portland. And we asked to see their record books of funerals from the mid-20th century to try to find that man's name, because the cemetery had nothing. And we thought, if you don't want to find his family, we'll find his family. So we kept adding more people to our roster of people who needed to be discovered. And in the end, they were not terribly cooperative, but also there was a fire, like many churches. There was a fire at the church that destroyed a great number of their records. So they actually weren't able, they were very willing, but not able to give us the information that we would need in order to identify that man's family. So all we could do was rebury him, put some flowers at the grave, say some words, and make a decision to no longer dig in that place. Because the other option was, if you really want to find Bessie, do you completely unearth the vault and dig underneath? And I thought, again, the cost to this man's piece is actually greater than whatever we would gain by unearthing Bessie. We would be prioritizing her life over his in that moment, and that was a sort of a threshold for me as well. So those were the kinds of choices we made. And then on the Ghana side, this was a very important question about how we keep graves. The cemetery in Ghana is in some places quite hectic in this particular cemetery. And it's also a cemetery that is new, relatively speaking. So it's a kind of Rawlings era cemetery because the previous cemetery was sold for housing developments. So you could actually go to the old cemetery and people would point and say, this is the old cemetery, and somebody's house is built on it. And I always say this is part of the paradox of Ghana life, because people will say they respect the ancestors and so on and so forth, but you want to live on top of somebody else's ancestors and not even care about them. So it's some of the tensions that we ran into were how do we deal with the fact that people may not keep up this grave a generation from now, and that most graves will not have upkeep 2 generations beyond. That's just a fact, it's a reality. All I could do was take care of this generation, so some of the dialogues that I was having in the wake-keeping process, people who began to feel connected to Bessie, who lived in Cape Coast, also agreed to tend her grave while I was not there. So people have sent me pictures of cleaning the grave, of putting flowers there, and because I know that cemetery quite well, I would point out when I found their relatives in the same cemetery. And so as a result, they would go tend Bessie's grave and then go visit a relative that they just learned about through the Bessie process. So it was a sort of interdependent tending that brought other ancestors into the present that had been forgotten with weeds overgrown and so on. So I considered it a very mutual process, not like a series of favors, but something we do for one another. And I have also agreed to go with other people in Cape Coast and tend their graves as well with them. So it's a joint process that is ongoing.
Yeah, so in identifying my protagonist, Fati, the approach was to make the film as intimate as possible, to understand her inner fears and also the reasons and how the society impacts on her decisions. So I started off with a phone call about a month. Then we started having conversations. So when I met her, it wasn't like a structured interview, no. I just wanted her to be very comfortable. I didn't want it to be intimidating because there were also kids involved, so we had to bond with the kids. So sometimes she was in 2nd D and I was in Accra. And luckily I have another family house in Cape Coast. So I had to go to Cape Coast and then be trekking between Cape Coast and 2nd D, like continuously for about a month, for her to be very comfortable because, it also wasn't just about her, it was also about the community. It was a very small community. So even my presence there, there was an incident where I went there one day to have a conversation with her. After I left, one of her friends was like, "This you shouldn't do it because it's obvious they are going to bring you on TV begging for funds." You see, so there was a lot of distrust, about you coming into the community to make a film. So it was a whole, not just for us, it was just even making the community, the people, the neighbors understand that this is what we want to do about Fati. So it's not just about the reason, but something deeper than, it goes deeper, it goes far beyond Fati's story, because this is other experiences that Fati could represent, So it took about 6 months before we took a camera to the community. So when we went there, we're like one of them, we eat from the community. We play football with the kids, we take the kids out and all that. So it made us get the best out of it. People were not looking into camera, hiding and standing behind. No, we're just part of the community because we wanted her to be part of the film process, So basically, that's how come we got this film made. And then I also realized that Fati's choices, for instance, her kids, the care of her kids supersedes the economic gains that she was going to get in Europe. Because at first when she told me that she came because of her kids, I still wanted to know why you came, because there are people who leave their kids. I mean, it's a very common practice in the community. So why you? And this thing wasn't posed like a formal question. It was through a conversation that she told me that she didn't have the opportunity to stay with her parents. She was also left with her auntie and living with family members. So she was just trying as much as possible to avoid her kids going through that experience. So that was the reason why she came.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's the powerful thing about the film, is that the reason that she goes is because of her children. Yeah. And the reason that she returns is because of her children. And it's so beautifully captured. So I know we're going to be pressing up on time, but we have, I think Chica, if you don't mind, we just push things back by 10 minutes, and we have like a 10-minute Q&A, and then we push back our coffee break. I see Naminata's hand, and I see Jean's hand. So maybe take 3 questions. Is there and Chica as well. So Naminata, Jean, and then Chica.
I mean, I really thank the organizer for a brilliantly curated panel. I've rarely seen a panel this coherent. And I can see many connections with March meeting. For example, there could be a connection between Rashid Qureshi in terms of, and Ebony, in terms of burial and reburial. And of course, there are so many other connections. Let's say David Ajayi and the question of the museum, and Kwesi, the question of museum. So many brilliant connections. But I have 3 short questions. The first one is to Fatima. Your name is Fatima. The title is Fatima's Choice, Fati's Choice. Can you tell us about that title? And then quickly to Kwesi. You're probably aware of the 3 R's: reparation, restitution, and restoration. Is your museum or your board interested or implicated in any way, shape, or form in that conversation? Repatriation, reparation, and restitution. So, and then quickly for Ebony and Jessica, your research practices, because here you're sometimes dealing with embodied spirits. So could you tell us more how your research process and methodologies change as you encounter these figures? Thank you.
I think I'll repeat. This was a fabulous panel. And from the early days, we tried to imagine a panel that really would complicate these ideas of departure and return, and this has done so brilliantly. So I thank you all for that. And I'm so moved that I'm not sure I can make my observations into questions, so take them as questions, even though they're not phrased as questions. First of all, it is International Women's Day, and I am struck by the power of the women's stories that were told. And so there's some kind of question in there about these stories as women's stories that I would be happy to hear any reflections on. But it also struck me how much storytelling, which you're also brilliant at, how storytelling is a way of connecting departures and returns, and that it's the main way that we can actually connect those two things. Then finally, my third is actually a question, I think, which comes out of something that you said, Ebony, but it was just kind of a mess in my head before, which is connecting the economics of these stories to the spiritual, the healing parts of these stories. So you can, say, oh, this year of return, it was just all about government and raising capital and investment. But then you see the power of the stories and the healing. So can these things actually occupy the same space, or in what kind of tension are they? And they're played out in very different ways in these stories. So I'd appreciate thoughts on any of those. Thanks.
My question is for Ebony, and it's very specific. The relationship between the capitalization of return that the two guys that you spoke about, and that of Marcus Garvey, which comes later. Do you know if there's any historical connection? Did Marcus Garvey basically scale up the business model, right? Since we are talking, capitalist-minded folks, did he simply scale it up, right? So SS Florida becomes Black Star Line, right? Maybe a few $100,000 in the 1415 project becomes multi-million-dollar several ships that he was going to buy, right? In the 1920s. So, and of course, that's the better-known story, right? And that's why I'm interested in this. Do you know if there were any connections, personal, business, historical, between the two?
I'll just answer that last one quickly first, because I've written on this too. So Chief Sam was definitely known to Garvey. They had an office about 10 blocks apart in Harlem. And unfortunately, Garvey sued journalists who wrote about them as being linked, because by the time he got started, Sam was considered a failure. And he thought it was a kind of negative press about his own operation. So certainly he scaled up. Certainly his mentor had introduced him to Sam's project in the early days. So there was definite knowledge of one and the other. And in fact, even after both projects, they circled each other in England for a time. But those kinds of connections were tricky to come by, because you have to be looking very closely at the Harlem map to see where their offices were and why they were repelling each other at a certain point. So it's a much longer story, but certainly that is the answer. And I think, to Jean's question, is often in my mind about how to get the spiritual and the economic to talk to each other, because I don't see them as, you can't separate them when there are material stakes in the reasons for separation, So the cost of return even is one way to think of it. In Bessie's case, I see her as human collateral, as someone who is valued and placed in a spot, and her own return is built into the concept of collateral, right? So for a time I was calling this project Collateral Witness. I was thinking about how she saw so much more of this movement than other people, than even her own father, because of where she was located and how she was left behind. So in some ways, the spiritual and the economic, to me, have to be more candid and not just opposed. And I like the idea of tension because, it's too easy to, on the one hand, justify the financial sort of transactions and quote-unquote opportunities with spiritual payoff, to say like, oh, you're going to have a great experience in Ghana if you buy this package. And on the other hand, the spiritual can get downplayed too, in a sense by a lot of the reasons why people avoid traditional priests, for instance, is because it seems to be a constant request for payment for various aspects of mediation. And so the two are always entangled, and I think it's worthwhile to pace through it. It's interesting for me that the cost of the spirit to travel across the Atlantic to go get Bessie was approximately $50, right? That was the spiritual airfare, as it was called. And so thinking about the way prices are put on things, the priest then called me right after the funeral and said, this time next year you have to give another $50, right, to maintain the acknowledgement of Bessie's return. And at first I was like, oh, because I've been taught to be like, here you come with the hustle. But I paused. Something in what he was saying was about the way that we have these material transactions to acknowledge we're doing something on this material plane for a spiritual purpose. And so I actually said, sure, when I come back to Cape Coast next year, I will do that. And then he died. And I called his son, and I said, I'm going to come to Cape Coast and give you that $50 for his funeral. Because to me it was all part of a cycle of the way death and money interact. And perhaps this is back to your point, the way that death and memorialization and tourism interact when we're thinking about those who have died in the Middle Passage. So I think we have to talk about it with more nuance and not just oppose the two. And I'm constantly looking for different ways to do that. And then the last thing is the methodology question. I do think one thing, there was a big thing shifted, and that is what I kept calling the impossible questions. I literally would wake up in the morning and say, what's your impossible question? A question you think you can't answer, you, Ebony, cannot answer today. And I would wake up and say, I'm really frustrated because I don't know exactly when Bessie was born and I don't know how to find out. And I would literally write it on a piece of paper in the morning and leave it. And that was a kind of open-ended invitation. Because by this point, I just said, Bessie, if you want to answer it, fine, because I can't answer it. And instead of treating that as a roadblock, I simply let it be. And many times during this process, by the end of the day, I had an answer. In the case of the birth year, by the end of the day, I had gone to visit the Wesley Chapel, and the archivist there, who's notoriously strict about not giving you access to records. I walked in there, told her this story briefly, and walked out. 15 minutes later, she called me and said, I have it. And it's just unheard of. It just doesn't happen like that. But every day something like that happens. So I began to think of these as impossible questions in quotes, because they were the limit of my researcher imagination, and other things were possible.
Thank you. So I know yes, Laz is signaling to me.
My sincere apology for disappearing for, while. But I just want to, I hope the question that I would raise or comment.
No, you can't raise a question.
No, it's okay.
Sorry, because we've fielded 3 questions, and only Ebony's been able to answer, and we're also running up on time, so I want to give everybody else a chance to answer the questions that have posed. So maybe, however.
Yeah, the question was whether my institution was involved in the restitution, reparations, and whatever. Come again? Repatriation. My institution was set up just at the eve of Ghana's independence. You know, last Sunday was 63rd or 5th anniversary of Ghana's independence. And so on the eve of the celebration, or that day, the president inaugurated the institution. And his objective was to educate the general public about the history and the story of the transatlantic slave trade so that we can take a lesson from it. And since then, I think the laws that regulate the institution has not been amended, and therefore the institution sits on just restoring the facilities, improving on education, and also management of the facilities. And so some of us Pan-Africanists have then taken us upon ourselves to represent on the reparation meetings, if there is, and share our ideas on that. And so, it may not be the mandate of the institution, but staff of the institution do that, and I do that regularly, right? And so, I'll give credit to my institution, and therefore I will say, yes, we do, but officially, no. That's not part of our mandate. But as a staff, I'm part of some programs and activities that work on reparation, restitutions, and particularly Pan-African is not about reparation or restitution, but it also talks about it. There are some themes sometimes that talks about reparations and restitutions, and we that's what we do.
Thank you. So quickly, Fatima, and then Jessica.
Yeah, so the question was why the title Fatih's Choice, right? Oh, that was a coincidence. Yeah, so that is her name in this. That's her real name, but it was just coincidence that we share the same name, you know. But actually, it was Fatih's choice because she made a very difficult decision that few are able to make, and hopefully, that choice she made will break a certain cycle within her immediate family. Yeah. So basically, that was it.
Okay, my answer can be very, very quick. In terms of research methodology, I had to completely change what I was doing. I had to start thinking on a different plane. So every single morning, there's tea or coffee, whatever I'm drinking. Charity prefers tea, but sometimes she gets coffee. I have a song for my daily ritual. Charity has a song. Now the women in the dungeons have a song. Everyone's starting to have a song. It's a complete gospel fest in my house. And so I've been feeding these altars lately, trying to get to the slave dungeons. And this goes directly back to Jean's question. And so I was going to, again, talk about digital humanities and something else. And, you know, the way they talk to you, Charity Folks made herself known, and, you know, by someone calling me saying, hey, I have some more tidbits. Oh, I have more DNA. And Charity Folks literally said to me, you're going to an international conference and you're not going to introduce me? Because I've got a great story. So here we are.
Thank you. So I think we're really at time, but Salah, if you want to reset the clock here, I welcome a question from you.
It's really just had to do with the issue of genetics and science becoming a portal to history.
Yes,
I don't know if somebody...
Jessica took that head on, so...
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you took it on, all my comment is that why really even go to it? I mean, Eduardo Rousseau said it's not the real question. If you think about it in the context of the poetic of relation, at the same time, Alondra Nelson and many other people point to the whole commercialization. Not only that, but it's also, if we're thinking, why really actually even, if people move within the continent, whether the person end up being a Zulu, like Oprah said she wanted to be a Zulu, it didn't end up being a Zulu, she ended up being from Guinea or Equatorial Guinea or so forth. It doesn't matter. People move within the continent. Does it really matter that this woman, sorry that I blocked the name, but I thought it was a very...
Charity.
Charity, who's actually a beautiful name in and of itself. And it shows the whole idea of remaking the self within the context of the diaspora. Does it matter that she goes to Ghana?
I wanted to say one thing about it. As you were saying, does it matter? I was thinking of Charity and contemporary people who I see every day who say they want to go to Ghana even though their DNA test doesn't match up and so on. And when I think about the 1915 migrants, some of them listed in their passports that they were sojourners looking for a place to call home. So part of what they were looking for was a certain kind of infrastructure, a certain kind of livability, a certain way to make money, certain criteria that were more important for them. And I think today it's the same way. You see people coming to Ghana because they think it's livable and possible, and that's the priority for resettlement, it's the priority for tourism. So even if they don't exactly have a match, if the opportunity is there or the package tour is there, they would take it sooner if it was easier than if some other place were to be high on the list. You know, I know a lot of people who are actually find their roots in Angola, you know, and they're less eager, right? For some reason, they would say, I'd rather go to Ghana. So I think it's still part of the mix, but it doesn't override.
Jessica, did you want to say any?
I will say that, you know, and this goes back to your first question, this is also about belonging and wandering spirits, because Charity Folks was definitely a wandering spirit. So I had the opportunity to take her back to Ghana. I also had, during COVID, the opportunity to take a friend who had passed. He had always wanted to go to Ghana. So I had to do this whole thing with his children and brought some things of his back to Ghana. I want to say that it doesn't matter, because people are in search of belonging and they settle where they feel most comfortable. I want to say that. I'm not a science person. I think the science can be used to, again, flesh out, you weren't here for this, but flesh out some of the answers. I want to say that it doesn't matter as long as that person finds peace, but I also think that also produces all kinds of other questions.
Did you have one final?
Yeah, actually, in a town where I schooled, there's a suburb known as Bebianiha. Everywhere is here. Yeah, everywhere is here. So, and again, the question is, what is home? Home is where you identify with. So even if my real parents reject me and someone accepts me in their home, that is my home. And so irrespective of where you come from, if you identify with Ghana and you come there, we're ready to welcome you and make you part of us. And people have been comfortable coming to Ghana and feeling at home. And so Ghana is home.
Right. And in part, that's been made possible by the infrastructure that's been built to do that. And I think that going back to that, and this will be the last word for, we should stop, but this idea, this economy and revenue streams, that are calculated and they're built over time and they're profitable, doesn't mean that that it can't sit side by side with meaningful forms of return. Both are happening at the same time, and it's sometimes complex, oftentimes contradictory, but they're there together, and that's what we have to wrestle with it. So thank you all for...
I have one question, please.
Okay.
One small question. Please.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. This is to you, Ebony. Within the context of African spirituality, when it comes to exhuming, the corpse, there is an important ceremony, ritual that must be done. Libation has to be made, or someone close to the person to be exhumed must be there to give permission right there. Prayers must be said. Some kind of ritual must take place. There must be a pre-ritual and a post-ritual when you are going to bury. I would like to know if you did perform that pre-exhumation ritual in the United States.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so let's... Rashid, yeah, we're stopping. Thank you. Rashid wants a question, wants to ask a question.
J'espère qu'il y a un traducteur d'abord. Moi, c'est drôle. Tout ce que j'ai écouté ce soir me paraît bizarre par rapport à ce que je vis dans l'arrivée des migrants sur les côtes de la Tunisie que je connais. Vous parlez des gens qui veulent revenir au pays. Moi, j'accueille des gens qui quittent le pays. Et chacun que j'ai interrogé, il a une odyssée totale à raconter. J'aurais voulu qu'il y ait des écrivains et des personnes qui viennent chaque fois écouter chaque histoire. C'est fabuleux. Ils ont croisé la mort à plusieurs reprises. Ils arrivent en Tunisie et immédiatement les pieds sur le sable, ils veulent repartir vers le nord, vers l'Occident, alors qu'ils ne savent pas, moi je vis en Occident, c'est un esclavage absolu. Les autres, on les a pris de force vers l'esclavage. Ceux-là, eux, ils vont avec la volonté de sauter la mort pour être esclaves en Occident. C'est terrible comme situation. Je voudrais bien qu'on y pense.
So, I got part of that in my really terrible French, so I'm gonna maybe, Naminata, do you mind if we call upon you just to kind of summarize what Rashid said?
My understanding, he said that this was very terrifying, that you are talking about those who are willing to go back, but he is dealing with people who are every day challenging and meeting and encountering death when they try to go through Europe, through the Mediterranean. And as soon as they brave death every single day, they land on the Mediterranean soil. They want still to go back to Europe to become enslaved, because going to Europe, to the West, is a process of enslavement. And he really wishes that there will be artists and writers and painters to listen and to bear witness to what these people are saying when they, brave death and reach the soul of the Mediterranean toward a process of enslavement.
Amen. So one thing that I want to say is that please watch Fatih's Choice. And also, at the end of the conference, we have a closing conversation where we can bring back questions that weren't asked, make connections across the different panels and with the March meeting. So this doesn't have to be the last time that these questions get discussed further. So we'll break for a very short coffee outside in the lobby, and then we're going to come back for Chika's wonderful talk this evening about El Anatsui. Thank you.